The king lived in constant fear of his own body, shattering into a million pieces. This is the true story of King Charles VI of France, a monarch genuinely convinced he was made of glass. By the end of this journey, you will understand how one man's fractured mind nearly broke an entire kingdom. We will uncover what could drive a person to such a bizarre belief and explore the political chaos that followed. What does a mind so fragile reveal about the nature of power itself? He inherited a throne of gold at the age of 11, a boy king known as Charles the Beloved. His early reign was guided by powerful uncles who ruled a France already strained by the endless conflict of the Hundred Years' War and a deep religious crisis, the Papal Schism, which saw two different men claiming to be the one true pope. For a time, the young king embodied hope. He was charming, handsome, and initially popular, but the pressures of a fractured world were immense. The first cracks in his mind appeared subtly, with bouts of fever and confusion that his court dismissed as passing ailment. Then, in the sweltering summer of 1392, the facade shattered completely. While leading his army through a forest in Brittany, a sudden, terrifying noise startled the king's party. A lone soldier, drowsy with heat, had accidentally dropped his lance, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. For Charles, it was a trigger. Consumed by a sudden, psychotic delusion that he was surrounded by traitors, he drew his sword. He swung wildly, attacking his own knights, his own loyal men. He killed 4 of them before he could be subdued and wrestled to the ground. This was not a moment of rage, but a complete break from reality. The beloved king was gone, replaced by a man lost to a profound and terrifying illness. His condition was not a single event, but a disease that progressed in waves. He would experience periods of lucidity where he seemed his old self, only to plunge back into the depths. In these episodes, he forgot his own name, failed to recognize his wife and children, and ran wildly through the corridors of his palaces, convinced he was being pursued. This was the man upon whom the fate of a nation rested, a king whose mind was becoming a prison of its own making, just as his kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse. And then came the delusion that would define his reign. The king's fractured mind latched onto a single, terrifying certainty. He became utterly convinced that his body was not made of flesh and bone, but of glass. He believed he was a living, breathing statue, a fragile vessel that would shatter into a million pieces upon the slightest impact. A firm handshake could be fatal. A stumble would mean his destruction. This was not a metaphor for his mental state, but a concrete, unshakable reality for him. To protect his brittle form, Charles VI took extraordinary measures. He had special clothing tailored with iron rods sewn into the fabric, a rigid internal skeleton meant to brace his imaginary glass body against the world. He refused to mount a horse, terrified that the motion would cause him to crack apart. When he needed to be moved, servants would transfer him with immense care, often carrying him on cushions to prevent any jarring movement. His entire existence became a carefully choreographed ritual to avoid breaking. This profound fear paralyzed not just a man, but an entire government. Court life adapted to the king's psychosis. Councils were held in hushed tones, diplomats tread lightly, and the machinery of the state slowed to a crawl, all governed by the monarch's fragile self-perception. He was a king who could not bear the weight of his own crown, for fear it would shatter his skull. Intriguingly, King Charles was not entirely alone in this bizarre belief. His case is the most famous, but history records others who shared this glass delusion. A princess in Europe reportedly refused to leave her chair for years, fearing she would break if she stood. Even a respected scholar was said to have conducted all his conversations from behind a padded lectern, just in case. This strange psychological phenomenon seems to have been a specific manifestation of anxiety among the European elite, a tangible expression of feeling exposed, brittle, and utterly vulnerable. For Charles, the fear was literal, but its roots were in a world that was, quite literally, falling apart around him. While the king was haunted by his own fragility, his kingdom began to splinter around him. His periodic descents into madness created a power vacuum at the very heart of France, a dangerous void that the nation's most powerful nobles were all too eager to fill. Two factions, led by the king's own relatives, plunged the court into a bitter and bloody struggle. On one side was the king's brother, Louis, the Duke of Orleans. On the other was his cousin, John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy. Their rivalry was not just a family feud, it was a civil war for the soul of France. This internal conflict, which history would name the Armagnac Burgundian Civil War, tore the country apart from the inside. The royal government, already struggling to function with an incapacitated monarch, became a battleground. Every decree, every tax, every military decision was now a point of contention between these two warring houses. The dukes raised their own armies, not to fight the English, but to fight each other, draining the kingdom's resources and shattering its unity. This self-inflicted wound could not have come at a worse time. Across the Channel, a new and formidable English king, Henry V, saw France's internal chaos as a golden opportunity. He launched a massive invasion, meeting a fractured and leaderless French army at the famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The result was one of the most catastrophic defeats in French history. The French chivalry, bogged down in mud and riddled with conflicting commands from the feuding dukes, was slaughtered. Thousands of French nobles fell in a single day, a devastating blow to the nation's morale and military strength. The human cost was staggering, but the political cost was even greater. The defeat at Agincourt was a direct consequence of a kingdom that had lost its head, a monarchy paralyzed by the unfathomable fear of a king who believed he was made of glass. His personal delusion had crippled the state, leaving it vulnerable and divided. The very real glass of the king's mind had, in a terrible and tragic way, brought the entire French kingdom to the brink of shattering. Centuries later, we are left trying to diagnose a ghost. What was the true nature of the illness that convinced a king he was made of glass? Modern psychiatry offers several compelling theories, though each comes with its own set of challenges. One strong possibility is schizophrenia, a condition characterized by psychosis, delusions, and a break from reality. His sudden, violent outburst in the forest and his unshakable belief in his own fragility are classic hallmarks of this disorder. Another plausible explanation is bipolar disorder, which would account for the dramatic swings between his periods of lucidity and his debilitating episodes of madness. Yet the mystery may be even older than the king himself. The roots of his suffering could lie in his bloodline. His mother, Joanna of Bourbon, also exhibited signs of severe mental instability, suggesting a possible genetic inheritance of illness that manifested so tragically in her son. There is also the intriguing theory of porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can cause abdominal pain, seizures, and profound mental confusion, including hallucinations and paranoia. This condition, sometimes called the royal malady, afflicted later monarchs in other dynasties and presents symptoms that eerily mirror some of Charles VI's suffering. We must also consider the immense, unrelenting pressure of his position. Inheriting a fractured kingdom as a child and bearing the weight of a nation at war would be a profound trauma for any mind. His psychosis could have been the mind's final, desperate retreat from a reality that was simply too unbearable to face. Of course, diagnosing a historical figure is a fraught endeavor. We are piecing together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, relying on chronicles written by courtiers with their own agendas. The treatments he received tell us far more about his era than his illness. Medieval doctors, lacking any concept of modern psychology, believed his affliction was a spiritual or physical imbalance. They subjected him to exorcisms to drive out demons, forced him into prolonged rest to rebalance his bodily humors, and even attempted shocking him back to sanity. A brutal practice based on the idea that a sudden, intense fear could jolt the mind back into place. These methods, born of ignorance and desperation, did nothing to cure the king and likely worsened his torment. His story is a stark reminder of how a society's understanding of the mind shapes its treatment of the mentally ill. For King Charles VI, the cure was as terrifying as the disease. The story of Charles VI is a profound tragedy written not just in the chronicles of France, but in the very architecture of a fractured mind. His reign stands as a haunting testament to a single, unsettling truth, that the most formidable fortress can be breached not by armies, but by a thought. His glass delusion was far more than a bizarre footnote in a history book. It was a perfect storm of personal trauma, genetic predisposition, and the crushing weight of a crown on a mind too fragile to bear it. In his fear, we see the medieval world laid bare, a place where the line between spiritual malady and physical sickness was blurred, and where the treatment for a broken psyche could be as cruel as the illness itself. His story forces us to look beyond the throne and the scepter, to confront the vulnerable human being at the center of all that power. It reminds us that leadership, no matter how absolute, is always exercised by a fallible mind. The king who feared he was made of glass ultimately reveals a universal fragility, one that connects us across the centuries. The human mind, in all its complexity, remains our most precious and delicate possession. What other historical figures do you think embody this strange intersection of power and psychology? Share your thoughts on other fascinating minds from the past in the comments below, and subscribe for more journeys into the deepest mysteries of history.